webinar is now streaming live on custom live streaming service.
Yeah, that's the trick, isn't it? Is to figure out where it's actually going. Should be going.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's the real thrill of this panel, is you can watch us figure out how to work a Zoom call live.
Yep, it's working.
All right. Well, we should have Chairman of the FCC Ajit Pai joining us very shortly. So, looking forward to that.
I mean, he retweeted the neoliberal project's little re-up tweet earlier, so
he's followed the account for quite a while. So
really?
it's super interesting. For years now, he's followed the Twitter account. So, I don't know. Maybe he's just been a fan for a while.
That's awesome. We'll make this last mile unbundling thing go a little further then.
So, for everyone in attendance, we'll probably repeat this at some point, but the way we're thinking about structuring this is that for the first 40 or 45 minutes, we're going to be, asking Chairman Ajit Pai a bunch of questions about what the FCC does, net neutrality, ISP competition, a bunch of other stuff, a bunch of stuff about what the FCC does. And they're going to be our questions. At the end of the hour, for the last 15 or 20 minutes, I'm not sure how long exactly it will end up being, but near the end, we are going to try to take some questions from the chat. So as you watch, if you have questions, please, enter them into chat, and we'll see them, and we'll try to ask the questions towards the end. So we do want it to be at least a little bit participatory. So just keep that in mind.
There we go, everyone filtering in. Good idea to start a little early. This is exciting.
Oh yeah. And hopefully, and obviously this is going to be a bigger event than just the Charlotte chapter, but hopefully we'll see some local Charlotte people that we recognize.
There's already a couple. Sydney. There we go.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, doing good.
Hello.
How are you?
Pretty good. Yeah, good to see everybody.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad it works.
Yeah.
Right. I have to ask, I see the name there is Montana Hyde, which sounds like a cowboy from a Western movie.
Oh, that's hilarious. It's actually, that also is true, but it's my assistant, so she must have logged in. I don't know if there was a unique link sent to her or something, but yeah.
Well, she's got a very cool name, so. Well, we will give just a couple more minutes for people to filter in, because we're just a little bit early. But while we're doing that, I'm kind of checking out the bookshelf behind you. It's everybody's favorite game now on the internet is to play the who's got the coolest bookshelf game.
I know. Yeah, it's kind of eclectic. A whole bunch of stuff, like some nonfiction, some fiction. Just random stuff.
If I was going to ask one like question that's not really a serious question, not part of this, but like what's one book you would recommend off that shelf if you're going to just grab one?
Oh my God. Well, so I don't even know, is it on this book? I have a whole bunch in here, but so The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris is one of my favorite books. And it's, I don't know if you've read it, but Morris's style is just fantastic, just in terms of the raw writing ability. And then on top of that, I mean, the first volume covers TR from birth all the way up to when he's first sworn in as president, when McKinley dies. And it's just, you just can't, like a larger than life American figure. And it's just really inspiring and just a great story.
Yeah. So if anybody ever needed a biography, it was him. So
definitely. And it's an acquired taste, I concede, but Conrad is one of my favorite writers, Joseph Conrad. So Lord Jim, Heart of Darkness, of course, got a collected version or collected stories from him. So it's pretty good too.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll give the warning one more time for the people in chat. This will be recorded, so if anybody has to drop out halfway through, you'll be able to watch it later. And we have a bunch of questions from the Neoliberal Project. My name's Jeremiah. My co-host is Morgan. And at the end of the panel, if there's time left, we're planning to take a few questions from chat.
Sure.
So anybody who's attending, just keep that in mind. Morgan, anything else before we get started?
I don't think so. Coming in hot on 8 o'clock. So this is quite exciting. Jeremiah, I'll lead off, and then I'll do a couple, and you do a couple, and it'll go well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, look forward to it. Yeah, thanks for getting in touch too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's nice to know that people are reading their emails out there.
Yeah, it's definitely me. It's not a bot reviewing them or anything like that. So, yeah.
Right. That was fantastic, and Montana's been a huge help with all this.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thanks. I think Evan on my team might be on the call too, and I know he's been very helpful too.
Oh yes. All right, 8 o'clock. Let's get going. Do a little local record, just in case, because that's what YouTube says. All right. Hello and welcome everyone to another Q&A event with the Charlotte chapter of the Neoliberal Project. I'm Morgan Reinhardt, organizer of the Charlotte chapter. Joining me today are Jeremiah Johnson as co-host and our guest Ajit Pai, chairman of the FCC. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, Chairman.
Hey, good to be with you.
Fantastic. All right, let's kick off with something that's relevant to everybody these days. How has the coronavirus pandemic affected the priorities of the FCC and your work?
Yeah, it's been pretty transformational, I've got to say. Ever since early March, when we realized that hundreds of millions of Americans were going to be shifting to staying at home, including the FCC itself, I issued a telework order essentially to our FCC staff before any state in the country had issued a stay-at-home order. And so that meant immediately that millions of people were going to be relying on the broadband networks more than ever before. And so we immediately put into place what we call the Keep Americans Connected pledge to ensure that broadband and telephone providers maintain service for Americans who continue to have it, even if they were unable to pay a bill and without having to pay late fees and the sort, and also opening up any Wi-Fi hotspots to anyone who might need them. And over 750 of those providers took the pledge, which extended until May 15th. We extended the pledge until the end of June, and 800 providers signed up for that extension. So that's been a core part of our work. In addition to that, just getting all of the different regulatory changes done that we need to get done. Temporary access to spectrum, for example, for big wireless companies and small rural Indian tribes, changing some of our E-rate rules to make sure that schools and libraries have connectivity on an emergency basis. Just a whole bunch of work that's gone on top of the bread and butter work of the FCC. And it's been a very challenging time, to say the least, not just for me, but for the FCC's terrific 1,400 or so staff who all are working from home for the most part. But I'm glad to say that they are just incredibly dedicated public servants who, they used to come to the office every day, determined to meet the public interest, and now they're doing it from their homes just as I am. And I can't say enough about what incredible career staff we've got and how lucky I am to be a coworker of theirs.
So one of the things that's happened during coronavirus is you hear a lot of stories about how internet traffic is way, way, way up. And particularly, I think in some European countries, it varies, but you hear stories about like people are having to get their Netflix slowed down, or YouTube, their quality is kind of degraded. How has the American infrastructure for broadband internet held up during this time? And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the European case either.
Oh, very much so. I've been following it with great interest, given the fact that they have, generally speaking, a very different regulatory framework. And here in the United States, we've definitely seen an uptick. It's leveled off somewhat over the past couple of months, but in the immediate months, I'd say March and April in particular, when everyone was immediately shifting back home, we saw incredible upticks, both in terms of the percentage of usage on fixed networks, for example, it went up something like 20 to 35%. On mobile networks, 15 to 25%. And the time of usage also shifted. So typically, of course, home broadband would spike in the evenings when people get home from work. Now it's pretty much evenly distributed throughout the day. And also, instead of, as you might expect, a lot of the usage clustering in larger cities, it migrated to the suburbs and exurbs where a lot of the people tended to live. And so we were wondering about how these networks would fare, and they've fared extremely well for the most part. And one of the reasons why, after talking to a lot of technologists and others, is because the architecture of these networks was designed for a much higher peak load than even the peak that we've seen over the last couple of months. And so even with the increase in the usage on the mobile side, which is typically the most constrained part of the network, it's been incredible, the incredible ability of these networks to withstand the load. And part of that is also because we've, as I said, gave them temporary access to companies to get spectrum needs met very quickly. But part of it is also the overall regulatory framework we've had over the last 3 years. And the comparison with Europe is very, very interesting. As you pointed out, Commissioner Breton of the European Union, or European Commission rather, had to proactively go to YouTube and Netflix and all the other streaming services and ask them to proactively throttle traffic in Europe because they were not confident that their networks would withstand it. And that's a factor of something, I've talked about this a long time, that infrastructure investment is absolutely critical. Europe has consistently been, over the last several years, it's something like 50 to 60% of US capital expenditure. And over time, that means that your networks are going to be slower. And you see the results for themselves, unfortunately.
And it is interesting. I'm not sure if any, of the listeners are aware, but YouTube and Netflix by themselves almost are something like half of internet traffic. It's something absurd. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a crazy number.
It's an incredibly huge number, and it's only going to go up over time. I mean, we're only entering the streaming wars right now, and someone who's over the last couple of months consumed everything from Tiger King to Last Dance to Indian matchmaking in the last week or so. I'm just as much a beneficiary of it as a consumer. And I think the most unfortunate thing for those European consumers is now they've got a very arcane, hard, heavy-handed regulatory framework that disincentivizes infrastructure investment at precisely the moment when connectivity is more important than ever. And so I've heard from some of my counterparts on a member state basis in the EU that they'd like to have a more market-based framework like the American one, but obviously the EU regulations tend to govern in those cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and sort of staying on how sort of the investment has been so much greater here, that's obviously going to have some really interesting new technologies. What are some of these new and emerging technologies that the general public might not be aware of? Are there any that you're personally excited about that are rolling up or in this sort of swinging up ramp?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are a few that are within our bailiwick that I'm really excited about. One, of course, is 5G, which a lot of people have probably heard about or seen a commercial about, and there's a lot of hype surrounding it. But I think the core promise of 5G is to enable the connection of many, many things beyond our phones and our tablets. Everything from IoT applications that could be used in telehealth to high bandwidth applications and services like gaming or high definition streaming and the like. I think it's very, very exciting because 5G is not just incremental compared to 4G, but it's really just a game changer. Much lower latency, 100 times faster speeds, using a whole variety of different spectrum bands compared to 4G. So I think we're just scratching the surface there, and I'm excited to see what it's going to portend. But the other one I'm really excited about is space. And we're entering a new space age if folks aren't aware. And the great story here is that America's really leading the charge. We've got some super innovative companies like SpaceX, and there's a company called Swarm, which is doing 150 satellites in low Earth orbit, very small satellites. And one of the things that we prioritized over the last 3 years is to promote much more innovation and competition in terms of the broadband space from some of these space companies. We granted the applications for these low Earth orbit companies to launch satellites into low Earth orbit. We have made sure that we streamline the rules for those small sats or CubeSats, as they're sometimes called, so they don't have to jump through the same regulatory hoops company deploying a massive satellite. And I think in the next year or so, perhaps even sooner, you're going to see incredible benefits across the country for consumers, from the rural consumers who have never been able to get a fiber line to their house, to even shipping, for example. It's very difficult to get a broadband connection, but with these small sats, you might be able to do that. So I'd say 5G in space within our bailiwick are some of the technologies I'm excited about. They're technologies adjacent to what we do that I'm always loving to learn more about: artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, starting to try to get a sense of quantum computing. And there too, I mean, I think we're at the forefront of something very exciting, but it's hard to see how it's going to play out. And I just hope I'm around to see it all.
With regards to space, it seems like there's space is really interesting because obviously, like you said, it has a lot of promise, but it strikes me as something that we've got to be really careful with too. Like there could be potential negative externalities in terms of, if you send up too many satellites and, people are worried about debris in low Earth orbit and things like that. Is that something that that is regulated at all, or is that something that we think of as part of a regulatory framework, like potential negative externalities that occur from putting that number of satellites in space?
Absolutely. And you put your finger on one of the most important things that we've tried to do is a balanced approach to space. Obviously, I've talked about encouraging much more innovation, and that involves some of these NGSO, as they're called, non-geostationary satellite orbit constellations, sending up hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites into low Earth orbit. And the space environment, while it's large, it's also finite. And so the question becomes then, how do we coordinate amongst all these different users, and how do we ensure that orbital debris is mitigated? As those of you who've seen the movie Gravity from a few years ago know, that even a small amount of orbital debris can create a massive problem in space. And especially the further in the orbit it is, that debris can stay there for thousands and thousands of years. And so for the first time since 2004, I initiated an update of our orbital debris regulations. This is, of course, we license the satellites that go into space, but we also regulate the orbital debris mitigation techniques that they are required to use. And so, I think some of the companies have given us a lot of feedback, as well as other government agencies that have a stake in this. We're currently in the process of finalizing what our update should be, but I think it's incredibly important to promote innovation in space, but to do so safely, because the cost can be tremendous. And it's not just, of course, in the United States that is involved in space. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that many other countries are going to be sending up satellites as well. So there's a huge amount of coordination that has to happen, not just across our own government, but with foreign governments as well. And so you want to make sure that space environment is a safe one to operate in.
Fantastic. I didn't think that the debris would be under sort of the FCC's jurisdiction, but it does make sense.
Well, so you'd be surprised. So that's a good point, actually. So some people have contested whether we have jurisdiction. For example, the Department of Commerce has some jurisdiction over space issues. They have done a lot of work in space. And so some have argued in our record that, look, FCC, you might license the spectrum that these satellites can use. You might have some role in determining how and when they can launch from the United States, but you shouldn't have a role in regulating orbital debris. That's our jurisdiction. So there's a little bit of a turf fight there that some folks have seen. And so that's one of the issues we have to sort out from a legal perspective. Do we have the power? And then assuming we do have the power, what should those restrictions be? So it's not a cut and dried issue at all.
Look, when the founding fathers built the FCC, did they want space satellites regulated? That's the real question. Would Thomas Jefferson have approved of this?
Yeah, no, it's a very little known Federalist paper, Federalist in 156, in which Alexander Hamilton, writing under Publius, of course, talked about the need for a centralized FCC to handle all of the interstate commerce that is going to be happening over the airwaves and in space. And so highly commended to those of you who can find it on the internet.
I have to go write that. I just want to say welcome, Evan, for joining us. Evan is one of the chairman's policy advisors. So if you're wondering who this fourth person was popping in, that's who it is.
Yeah, he's a Yankees fan, but please don't hold him against him. He's a good guy.
All right. Okay, a little more down to earth now.
I see what you did there. Very nice. Very nice.
In 2017, Sinclair Broadcasting made a big stink with trying to buy Tribune Media.
Right.
And through the loophole isn't really a loophole, it's how UHF and VHF frequencies are counted towards your audience cap.
We'll say loophole with quotation marks.
Yes.
It's fair, but
but the deal that would have been that they might have been able to exceed the 39% audience cap that Congress set in 2004.
Right.
How do you, and I know that you wound up speaking up against that deal as Sinclair wasn't holding up their end of the bargain. How do you feel about this 39% audience cap?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different strands there. I mean, one is, as you pointed out, that we moved to deny the permission for those companies to merge in July of 2018, referred it to an administrative law judge, and then ultimately the companies dropped the merger. But aside from that, the question was the UHF discount, as you said. So dating everybody here, but there used to be UHF and VHF on the TV band. It was thought that UHF historically, many years before any of us were born, that UHF was much less desirable than VHF, so we counted it less for purposes of ownership, how we assessed ownership, because there's an ownership cap, as you pointed out. No broadcast company in the United States can reach more than 39% of the US audience, and that is set by statute. It's currently 39% ever since 2004. And so one of the things we did was to suggest we should get rid of the UHF discount. It's technologically outmoded. In fact, if anything, UHF is probably more desirable right now than VHF. So we saw no reason to treat them differently for ownership purposes. And at the same time, what I said was we should think about whether to adjust the national cap in terms of ownership. Just to give you an example, I mean, if I were to say only 39% of Americans should be able to do a Google search, or only 39% of Americans should be able to access Twitter, I mean, there'd be a revolution in the streets. Like, that's ridiculous. Why the hell is the government preemptively deciding where a company should be allowed to compete, how many eyeballs that company should be allowed to acquire? But because of these historical reasons set in law, there's a 39% limit in terms of broadcast ownership, a limit that I would argue that the FCC has the authority to adjust. And so the question for the FCC then is, well, should we adjust it, and what should we adjust it? Intellectually, someone made the argument that this is completely outmoded, that broadcast TV now is a tiny, tiny slice of the media marketplace. And the market cap of the entire broadcast industry right now is worth significantly less. It's a fraction of the value of Google just by itself. And so do we still need to have this 39% ownership cap, especially when broadcast is competing with many other types of media? That's a question that the FCC hasn't formally answered yet. But overall, I think that it's important to make sure that our regulations match the times. And the times it's not 2004 anymore, and it's not 1975 when our media ownership regulations were originally crafted. I think we are in a much more diverse market, much more competitive marketplace now. And I think that many people would like to see a more modernized view of what that ownership cap should be. But we'll see how it goes. I mean, there are people on both sides of this issue, to say the least. And it's still a political hot button here in Washington and across the country, I suppose.
Yeah, and the rules, one of the I'm not gonna say very few, but it's one of the ones I was reading about on the FCC website, where it's not, in terms of broadcast reach and audienceship, it's one of the very few that's not under regular quadrennial review.
Correct.
Is this right. Something you'd like to bring back as a quadrennial review, or is it something you just want to have Congress handle at some point?
It's a good question. Well, so our interpretation has long been that Congress exempted this from the quadrennial review every 4 years. For those who have the benefit of not being steeped in this stuff, every 4 years the FCC has to review its media ownership regulations and determine which, if any of them, should be revised or repealed in light of modern marketplace conditions. But in, I believe it's Section 202H of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, Congress exempted this whole UHF discount, the national ownership cap consideration, from the quadrennial review. And that's something over Democratic and Republican administrations, the FCC has said is always separate. So I certainly would love to tackle the quadrennial review issues. At some point, I think it's ridiculous now that you see all these mega mergers of multi-billion-dollar companies, but somehow if there's a radio station and a newspaper in Ottumwa, Iowa seeking to merge, everybody loses their hair. Oh my God, it's the end of competition as we know it. It's just ridiculous, I think, to have these media ownership regulation restrictions that date in some cases 1975. So we'll consider that, but the ownership cap stuff is statutorily anyway, the interpretation has been that it should be separate from the quadrennial review.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, that's the Sinclair thing. That and net neutrality are sort of the big things that I think have really defined your chairmanship.
Yeah, I've heard of that one too.
And
we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah.
Is this streaming, by the way? I thought how's this even happening? I don't know.
So in previous Q&As with state level candidates, we've had Ronnie Chatterjee on, who's running for state treasurer, and Jenna Wadsworth for Commissioner of Agriculture. They've both made a point that rural internet expansion in North Carolina is an issue. It's an issue a lot of places, but also especially North Carolina out east. There's farmers that have to go 2 miles to their neighbors to check their email. Things like things, very real things that matter to people trying to make a living. I've seen that you have championed the issue of rural internet access. How is the FCC facilitating this expansion, and how do you see the future of rural internet? Is it more wires? Is it more fiber? Is it wireless? Something like that?
These are the key questions that we've wrestled with over the last 3.5 years. And one of the things I do regret is that so much oxygen has been consumed by things like net neutrality that we haven't focused on what I think is the core issue in this country when it comes to communications how do we make sure that every American, regardless of who he or she is, regardless of where he or she happens to live, has access to the internet and other advanced technologies? And I say that in part, not just as a regulator, but just as somebody who grew up in rural America. I've come from a small town called Parsons, Kansas. I grew up on a dirt road outside of Parsons, which is 3 hours south of Kansas City, 2 hours from Wichita, 2 hours from Tulsa, very much off the beaten path. And whenever I go home, I'm keenly aware of the fact that the folks back there don't have the same opportunities that we've got here in Washington, or I'm sure folks have in Charlotte. And so we need to make sure, the FCC needs to make sure that we do everything we can, use every tool in the toolbox to get people access. And how do we do that? Well, we do have some tools. One of them is the Universal Service Fund, which is about an $8.3 billion annual revolving, essentially capital expenditure fund, you might say, that typically we have distributed to rural telephone companies for the aim of building broadband. But one of the fundamental reforms we introduced when I came into office was to, number one, target unserved parts of the country, as opposed to parts of the country that already had service. And number two, to encourage much more competition in the distribution of that funding. So instead of cutting a check to a rural telco and just saying, vaya con Dios, we hope you do the right thing, we've opened it up to competition from cable companies, from fixed wireless companies, from others using whatever technology, electric utilities, so long as you're willing to meet the FCC's service thresholds and serve the area, the rural area that you're dedicated to serve within a certain time frame, you're eligible for funding. And we're now seeing the fruits of those labors. There's something called the Connect America Fund, phase 2, that we did in 2018. And earlier this year, I've had the chance to visit some of the projects funded by CAF2 that are now completed. Gigabit fiber to the Wind River Reservation in Athene, Wyoming. Very poor Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone tribal area that's now getting broadband because of this program. We're moving ahead with the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund in a couple of months, October 29th, which is going to be a $20 billion fund to cover up to 6 million homes and businesses that are unserved right now. So subsidies is, that's one thing, which I know as a market-oriented person might sound odd, but I do recognize that there are market failures in this country where, absent federal support, you're never going to find a business case for deployment. And that's where we need to step in. We've also done a lot on the regulatory side, though, too, to make the business case easy as it can, to get quicker and cheaper access to utility poles, to focus companies' investments not on the fading copper networks of yesterday, but on tomorrow's fiber, to get a lot more access to spectrum in the commercial marketplace so companies can provide fixed wireless or mobile wireless services much more easily and cheaply, encouraging innovation from space to get new competitors who didn't even exist a few years ago into the marketplace. So we've done a whole bunch on the regulatory side too. And I know that the progress is slow to the folks out there who do have to drive a couple of miles. And I visited some of them, including in North Carolina. But all I can tell you is we are moving as fast as we can to close that gap. And I think the pandemic, if anything, has underscored that the digital divide, in my view at least, should be seen just as electrification was seen in the 1930s and 40s, as a national mission that we need to solve. And I would just close very quickly, sorry for filibustering, but if you go back to March of 2017, the first major speech I gave as chairman of the FCC was when they were talking about an infrastructure plan. I said, of all the things on Congress's plate, the number one thing they could do right now is allocate substantial funding for broadband to enable us to really close this digital divide once and for all using whatever technology. And just think now, if they'd done that in, say, March or April of 2017, where would we be now in July of 2020, now that broadband is even more essential than ever? I humbly submit that we'd be in a lot better position than we're in.
Well, I actually don't mind you, kind of filibustering right there, because this leads directly into the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is you mentioned competition, and competition among ISPs is not always in a great place in America. There's a lot of areas of America have very low ISP competition, especially if you're measuring by like broadband speed, people who can get 25 megs. Especially if you look at less dense settings, maybe rural America. And attempts to fix this are difficult because it feels like, attempts to create small ISPs generally run into a lot of problems, whether it's regulatory challenges. Some states have actually barred localities from, or tried to fight localities that want to do like a citywide ISP. It seems like it's just difficult to get this kind of thing done, to introduce more competition. So what can be done at the federal level, or how is the FCC in a position to address the fact that there is so little competition in so many areas of the country?
That's a really good question. And so we've done a lot within our authority to be able to address that. For example, in 2017, we started a proceeding to examine in urban areas in particular, how could we promote more competition where most people live, which is apartment buildings, or as we call them, multiple dwelling units. And one of the things we proposed was to look at different ways to ensure that the incumbent broadband provider didn't lock up an entire apartment building and forestall a new competitor from offering service to the people in that apartment building. It seems pretty basic. Yeah, and so that's one of the things that we've been exploring, and you're still taking feedback on those issues. And there's very innovative new companies like Starry, for example. I don't remember if they're in Charlotte or not, but they're in places like Boston and LA and Denver that are doing exactly this, that they are going essentially over the top of the incumbents, providing incredibly fast fixed wireless service at a really appealing price point. They're taking market share, and they are the types of companies we want to encourage to make sure that competition ultimately is available for all these consumers. But in less dense areas, that's a huge problem. It's an iron law of economics that you've got to get a return on the investment in order to justify building a broadband network. And especially when you're talking about broadband, very high upfront fixed costs. You've got to spend the money laying the fiber, getting access to the utility poles, hiring the work crews, et cetera. We need to make sure that whatever we can do on the federal level to augment that is done. So I've talked about the Universal Service Fund, and unusually among Republicans, I've said consistently that we need to amp up the amount that the federal government is supporting these broadband companies to build out new networks, because I think to me at least, there's a force multiplier in terms of the return on investments that all of us see when high quality broadband enters a town. But even beyond that, to make sure we break down some of the barriers that stand in the way of new competitors. One of them that I'll flag for you is in July of 2019, I believe it was in July of 2019, we adopted a revolutionary new reform called One Touch Make Ready. So if you look at any given utility pole as you're driving around in North Carolina, you'll see the top line is typically your electric utility line. The next line down is your cable company. But what if you're a competitive fiber provider? You want to provide broadband. Well, right before we adopted this reform, you'd have to go to the electric company, hat in hand, and say, hey, please, may we have access to your utility pole? The electric company has no reason to give you access, right? I mean, what do they gain out of it? Nothing. You'd have to go to the cable company and say, would you please mind moving your cable line up a little bit so we can attach our competitive fiber line a little bit below that, which is the competitive space. What incentive does the cable company have to do that? Very little. So what we did was to adopt a policy called One Touch Make Ready, where instead of having to ask these two incumbent entities, the competitive fiber provider can do that work on its own. It can move that equipment on its own higher up the pole and attach its competitive fiber. And we've heard from very small ISPs, many of them people have never heard of, like Rocket Fiber in Detroit or other smaller fiber providers that are using this reform to dramatically lower the cost element to building a broadband network. And that's the kind of thing we need to do in order to encourage much more competition. You also mentioned state laws. And so this municipal broadband, of course, is one of the issues that has been teed up for a while. And I've been very consistent from a legal perspective. I have no principled objection as a policy matter if voters of a state want to allow municipal broadband. I've actually visited, unlike many folks here in Washington, I've visited some of these broadband providers in places like very small towns in Iowa, like Spencer, Iowa, for example. And so to the extent that voters of a state allow them to do that, that's something that they are empowered to do. So to me, at least, the name of the game is to create as much of a business case, potentially with federal support as we can, for increasing the amount of competition in the marketplace.
One of the things that I've seen proposed as a way to kind of increase competition is the idea of last mile unbundling. Mm-hmm. And for those who aren't familiar, this is like, in my apartment, I have the choice of which electricity provider. For instance, if I want to get my electricity from company A or company B or company C, they can all use the same set of wires, basically, and anybody, I have choice there. And supposedly that, is a market-oriented policy that's going to allow for competition and better prices and better service. What do you think about the idea of last mile unbundling for internet or for broadband? Do you think that's something that we should be looking at?
So I would have some concerns about that. As you know, the FCC rejected that some 15 years ago. And the reason is, and I think that reason remains somewhat valid today, is that you dampen the incentive for companies to build that last mile infrastructure in the first place. And to the extent that the FCC came in over the top and said, hey, company A, we're really glad you built this fantastic last mile fiber infrastructure to connect Charlotte, North Carolina. now we're going to require you to wholesale it at rates at a cost that is determined not by the market, but essentially by the FCC, then the incentive for other companies to build that last mile infrastructure is dampened. So I think there's a trade-off there. I mean, obviously, as you pointed out, in the short term, you would get that competitive benefit, you might say, of being able to choose a bunch of different fiber providers. But I think the experience in the United States over the long run has shown that the effect of those, what is effectively a price control, I mean, it's a wholesale requirement that would dampen the incentive of companies to build out, ultimately dissuades capital expenditure. And here, I think Europe is very instructive. And if you look at the companies in Europe that have this widespread wholesaling requirement, I mean, they see CapEx on fiber in particular is very, very small compared to the United States, because the reason is no company is able to go to the capital markets and say, hey, loan us a bunch of money to build a great fiber network, which we'll then have to wholesale to our competitors. And that's just not something that generates a return on the investment. So I recognize, obviously, that there is a trade-off here, but I think in the end, the trade-off lies in favor of relaxing the unbundling requirements and promoting the other attempts to provide a more competitive marketplace. But I know it's a tough issue in many markets.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, and by the way, I should point out, so we do have actually an outstanding proceeding on this issue, the Uni Unbundling, or Unbundled Network Elements proceeding, where we're considering this very question. And so one of the things I proposed is to not relax the unbundling requirements in areas where there is no competition, where this is essentially the only provider in town. So, I don't want to suggest that I'm, doctrinaire across the board. If there's a demonstrated lack of any other infrastructure in town, then that's an area where I could see potential for unbundling requirements to remain.
It's always been something I've been fascinated in, just because, unfortunately, I've lived the last 8 years in an apartment with one provider where they told me who it was when I signed up, and that's where I am. So for me, it seems like, I would love to have the choice. I understand the concerns about CapEx decreasing over the long run. It seems like one of those balanced things. Moving to probably the biggest, most publicized thing that has happened during your tenure has been net neutrality.
Yeah.
Like you said, this has sucked up a lot of oxygen and a lot of discussion. And if people on the internet have heard about the FCC in the last 4 years, it's probably been because of that. So
well, either that or the mug, I suppose. But yeah.
So what have you? I'll start out by asking this: since regulations changed, or since the FCC observed it moved to a Title I classification in June 2018, what have you seen happen? Have you noted any particular changes, either for good or for bad, either in terms of content delivery or investment, or just, do you think that it has had much of an impact in any direction, or not much of an impact?
That's a good question. So I do think it's had a positive impact, and the numbers tell the tale. Aggregate capital expenditures have gone up. Speeds in the United States have gone up significantly. In fact, since we made our decision in December of 2017, the average fixed broadband speed in the United States has gone up 87%, not according to us, but according to Ookla, an independent third party who assesses broadband speeds in the United States. In addition, we've seen millions more Americans get access to the internet for the first time. I've mentioned anecdotally some of them who, thanks to USF subsidies from us, have been able to do it. But many, many more without FCC subsidies companies have been able to extend the reach of their networks. And so overall, I think it's enormously positive. And I think it's also useful to remember some of the predictions that were made back in December of 2017. I mean, just ridiculous, over-the-top predictions that the internet's going to work one word at a time. You're going to have to pay $5 per tweet. Or my personal favorite, this is the end of the internet as we know it. And I was kind of joking earlier about the fact, how is this even working? But I think it's the fact that infrastructure in the digital space has to expand, has to scale over time to accommodate the increase in consumer demand. You must have a light touch regulatory framework in order to do that. And again, the European example is illustrative. They have a utility style net neutrality approach across every member state that's a member of the European Union, 28 member states. And the results speak for themselves. 50% CapEx of what we've got here in the United States. When the pandemic started, they had to proactively go to Netflix and YouTube and ask them to throttle. You don't see, in terms of wireless investment, I mean, if you've ever spent a lot of time in Europe, you know that you're all quite often on 3G as opposed to 4G. So
here's a question. What is, because obviously when we talk about, like, there have been some good outcomes in the last few years, faster speeds, more people with access. But the question is always, ceteris paribus, would that have happened without the policy change? I believe US, CapEx expenditures were already pretty far above Europe's even before the policy change. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. But in 2015 and 2016, we saw the first ever declines in CapEx outside of a recession since in the digital age. And so I would argue that just overall, the overhang of Title II regulation just created enough uncertainty that we were seeing, in fact, a decline in capital expenditures. And moreover, I would argue that, look, I want to hold the politicians who made these ridiculous claims to the fire. In February 26th of 2018, the entire Senate Democratic caucus said, if we get rid of net neutrality, you will get the internet one word at a time. The internet will slow down. That is demonstrably false. It did not happen. To the contrary, speeds increased 87%. And so, yes, I agree with the ceteris paribus approach, which is how, of course, an economist might approach things. But I think it's also important to look at things through the policy perspective that we've unfortunately, had to see things through in Washington. And a lot of these hysterical claims never came to pass. And to the contrary, the focus has now shifted to some of the Silicon Valley companies that were originally pushing these net neutrality regulations in the first place. And it's kind of interesting how the conversation has shifted, at least here in Washington, I'm sure in Charlotte and other places too, about the power of tech giants in the digital space. How are they deciding what we see and what we don't? Do they have too much market power, et cetera? So it's a very
Here's a hypothetical for you. Like you said, there were a lot of claims, if net neutrality goes away, you're going to see packages like, oh, you've got to pay $5 extra if you want access to Facebook. If you want access to ESPN's, .com, you'll have to pay extra. You'd have all these it would be like the cable packages of the internet.
Right.
That obviously hasn't come to pass. If something like that were to come to pass, or if, you saw really clear instances of, say, a certain internet provider giving really fast speeds for Hulu and really slow speeds for Netflix, and they announced, we're just doing this intentionally. If you saw really clear things that started happening like that, would it change your mind? Would you think that that's something that would need to be regulated at that point?
So two different things that I would discern in your question. The first is the hypothetical if they were to happen. So by definition, at least it seems to me, if the FCC is going to impose preemptive regulation on all 4,460 some internet service providers in the United States, there should be a demonstrable market failure that shows evidence of actual harms to consumers that are so widespread that post hoc regulation is not appropriate. The second thing is every single one of the hypotheticals you talked about, that's exactly why we have antitrust and consumer protection laws at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. The second example you use, for example, if they're favoring faster speeds for Hulu as opposed to non-affiliated programming, that's a classic vertical market power question that antitrust is designed to address. The same with the first one too. If a particular company is behaving poorly and hurting customers in a certain way, the answer then is to take targeted action based on consumer protection laws or antitrust, depending on what the issue is, against that company. It's not to regulate every single one of the providers, from Comcast all the way down to Amplex Internet in Lucky, Ohio, which has something like 500 subscribers, with these types of preemptive regulations. So to me, at least, the regulatory framework should be tailored to the nature of the harm in question. And to the extent we're talking about hypothetical harms indulged in by individual companies, as opposed to a widespread market failure, that is a classic issue of antitrust. Now, what I will say is what I've said publicly, that I do believe in those core principles of an open internet in terms of no blocking of lawful content, no throttling of lawful content, no anti-competitive paid prioritization, transparency, which is something that the FCC required that was never required before. I've just described in 15 seconds legislation that in an ideal world should pass Congress 535 to 0. And that's something I would support too, to put to bed this issue once and for all and focus our efforts on where they really belong, which is how do we close the digital divide. But obviously, legislation is not going to pass anytime soon, so that's unfortunately where we find ourselves.
Part of that divide is it has to do with how the FCC counts how many people actually have, a certain quality of internet, fast, slow, broadband or not. At the moment, the FCC uses census blocks, which makes sense, and then But some reports will say that this actually undercounts the amount of people that don't have broadband speed internet. Microsoft estimates that 163 million Americans don't have access or use high-speed broadband. Is this something that's of concern in your planning, in your like when you say speeds are up 80 something percent? Does that factor into sort of how you count, who you count?
So those are two separate questions: is what speeds do consumers get, and number two is where is the service? Mm-hmm. So with respect to the second question, I've long been dissatisfied with that census block approach that was adopted back in 2014, which essentially counted an entire census block as served if a single household in that block got service. And I'm sure this is the case in North Carolina, just as in Kansas. Census blocks can be pretty big, and by no means, if somebody in Parsons, Kansas has service, would that mean that my parents' house on the outskirts would have service at all? So one of the things we adopted in August of 2019 was what we call the Digital Opportunity Data Collection. Instead of simply having the broadband providers submit what's called Form 477 and just take it on faith, what we've done is to create a much more granular, much more accurate, and crowdsourced mapping system. So essentially, the broadband providers would tell us, okay, here are the geocoded locations where we have service. Then we would get verification based on our own analysis of it. And we would invite crowdsourcing. So consumers or state governments, local governments, tribal governments, farm bureaus, everybody would be able to test that and tell us where the coverage actually was and where it wasn't. And based on the synthesis of all that information, we'll have a much more textured and accurate view of where broadband is at what speeds than we do currently. And so that's something we're working on right now. In fact, just last 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, we adopted the final procedures to get that that new mapping system underway. Now we just need Congress to help us fund it to actually do the back-end IT work to get those maps stood up. But I completely agree with you that we need to have a much more accurate view, especially in rural areas, of coverage.
Fantastic. And part of that that might even mesh pretty well with it is there is a fund called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund.
Yeah.
Is that still on schedule?
It is.
The first auction's in October, I think.
Yeah, so it's in two phases. So for those who don't know, this is a $20 billion program to get fixed broadband to unserved parts of the country, but unserved and underserved parts of the country over the next decade. Phase one focuses on the unserved parts. These are parts of the country where, regardless of what map you consult, these folks are off the grid. There's no service there at the FCC's definition of 25 megabits per second or greater. And so there, on October 29th, we're starting phase one of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is $16 billion. It's obviously the bulk of the funds, but the reason is because those unserved parts of the country are traditionally the hardest to serve, they're costliest to serve. And we also want to encourage much more competition by drawing bidders in to serve those areas based on the FCC service thresholds. We've put a finger on the scale in terms of much faster speeds. So for example, if you're a gigabit fiber provider competing against a 25 megabits per second provider, you're going to have a significant bump in the auction. And if you meet the right budgetary amounts and commit to the service thresholds, you would have a pretty good chance of winning. And so that's going to start on October 29th. And whatever areas are not won in the auction, that funding will roll over into phase two of the auction, which we hope to start sometime next year. And so our goal here is pretty simple, that with the limited funds that we have available, to knock out as much as we can in those unserved parts of the country. Especially, I should have mentioned as well, the companion to that is what we call the 5G fund. This would be a $9 billion fund to target parts of the country that are very unlikely, absent federal support, to see 5G deployment from a wireless provider. And we're including $1 billion to support precision agriculture deployments on the 5G side. And so that's something that we're going to be looking to stand up as well. I think it's really important not to forget that many parts of the country in the 5G revolution are going to be left behind, as they typically have been in previous iterations of wireless technology, if the FCC doesn't make it a priority.
Especially with 5G's reduced range as coverage. I've seen that as an issue as well.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Sort of staying in Charlotte, but just local groups in general. Local groups are uniquely positioned to champion important policies. We've noticed a lot with a lot of issues lately with the pandemic and shutting streets down and whatnot, that if you just email like your little local city council, then they really do listen. But a topic that's rarely discussed at that level is telecommunications and ISP policy.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat inaccessible. It's hard. It's difficult. I mean, that if you go to the FCC website to look for stuff, there's a lot, and it's fantastic that you guys are able to cover so much. What policies do you believe that local groups should incorporate into their platform to try and improve ISP and telecommunications competitive landscape?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the overall approach that the neoliberal project, as you might say, has taken is a really good one to encourage, market-based solutions that promote access and competition for all. And when it comes to the communication space, there's no exception there. For example, I've met with some advocates in places like Detroit that have encouraged the city council to update its codes for the approval and permitting of the deployment of fiber. So, for example, if the city is digging up a road for a transportation project, at the same time, let a competitive fiber provider string conduit or put conduit, essentially a pipe under the ground, so they can string fiber, or anybody can string fiber under the ground, which dramatically lowers the cost structure for deploying a broadband network. Same thing with utility poles. The FCC does not have jurisdiction over the utility poles that are owned by municipalities. So if groups like you can work with your local gut city leaders to say, look, we understand that you're charging a high amount in fees to broadband providers to get access to attach their equipment to those poles. And that's great. We understand it's a revenue raiser. At the same time, it can dramatically inhibit the willingness of any company to build broadband further out into these towns. And so, we'd like to work with you in order to find a more market-based approach to doing it. Set fee on a set time to get access to these utility poles. I mean, very nuts and bolts things. And I know they're entirely weedy, and a lot of local leaders they're so consumed with so many things, especially during the pandemic. But again, I think broadband is one of the critical services during the pandemic, and I'd like to think that local leaders would give you a very willing ear if you came to them with concrete solutions like that. We also have, by the way, I should mention, we set up a broadband deployment advisory committee in 2017. And one of the first things they did was come up with state and local model codes for municipalities or states that are interested in broadband deployment. And so if folks are interested, you can go to our website. Somewhere on there, you'll find these model codes, and that could be a starting point for discussions. It can obviously be adjusted to meet the needs of Charlotte or any city that's interested in this.
All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to try to take a few questions from the Q&A portion here. So I'm just going to, I've been flipping through these, and there's a couple good ones in here.
Okay.
The first one I will say is, you could probably just say one word and know what the question is. Huawei. There's been a lot of talk recently because tensions with China in this administration have never been that great. But especially with what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening with Uyghur the people in camps in Western China, and with concerns about national security and allowing Huawei to provide parts of the 5G network or other services. So I guess just what role do you think the FCC has in communicating concerns about national security, in regulating that kind of stuff? To be honest, I'm not even sure what the FCC's jurisdiction is there. I don't have any expertise in that area, but I would love to know your thoughts about this whole thing, because it's a whole topic that spans regulations, national security, the military, the private sector. Everybody's kind of talking about it right now.
It's a great question. And so the answer is that we have substantial equities in this area, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, for example, one of the things that we proposed last year was to bar any telecom company in the United States from using money from our Universal Service Fund, that $8.3 billion annual fund, on equipment or services that were determined to present a national security threat to the United States. We worked with the national security agencies and the intelligence community on what those companies were, and we initially designated Huawei and ZTE, another Chinese company, as presenting such a threat. The FCC finalized that designation a couple of weeks ago, actually about a month ago now, I guess it was. And in the process of doing that final designation, we heard from Huawei and ZTE. We also heard from agencies across the government, as well as domestic telecom providers. And we determined that the threat was too serious to allow these USF funds from being used on those companies. But for starters, Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE are subject to Chinese law. And one of those laws is the National Intelligence Law, which requires any company subject to Chinese jurisdiction to comply with requests from the intelligence services. Another section of that law prohibits any such company from disclosing the fact of such requests. I mean, that alone presents a serious risk, to me at least, when you're talking about 5G networks that are going to underlie virtually every sector of our economy, from transportation to healthcare to manufacturing. Even beyond that, there are other agencies, the Cyberspace Administration of China, for example, that during the pandemic in particular, and with the upswing in unrest in Hong Kong, has exerted direct control, certainly over social media platforms like WeChat, but also, I would argue, over telecom companies, to make sure that all of them promote the worldview of the Chinese Communist Party and mitigate any security threats to the government, even extraterritorially. And I think if you look at the security law of Hong Kong, which was recently passed, they do exert extraterritorial jurisdiction over any Chinese citizen. So that's one of the things that does bother me quite a bit. So that, anyway, domestically, that's what we've been working on. There's also a supply chain executive order that we've been working on with some of our counterparts across the government to make sure that the entire supply chain has integrity to the maximum extent feasible. I've also been working on the international side with some of our counterparts around the world. And in the last year alone, I've been to the UK, the Czech Republic, Bahrain, Malaysia, Japan, Singapore, India. I met with the Brazilians, the Israelis, to try to share our views on 5G security, but also hear what some of their concerns are in terms of why it may or may not be feasible for them to take a similar road as we've done. And initially, some of the progress was halting, and we got some criticism, oh, this isn't really going anywhere. But over the last couple of months in particular, you've seen major progress. The most recent, of course, being the UK's decision to get rid of Huawei equipment that's in its legacy networks and to bar it prospectively. And I think you're going to see more countries like that following the US's lead. India is another one that's notable. We haven't done this, but India recently proposed an interim ban on 59 Chinese mobile applications, including TikTok, because it considered those to be too much of a threat, given the fact that a lot of the data that was being uploaded by Indian users was insecure, that it may be analyzed in China. So there's a lot more that we could talk about. I don't want to. So
there's not going to be an Ajit Pai TikTok account where we get to see all your TikTok dances.
Yeah, probably not. If you have the misfortune of following me on Twitter, you'll find my "You Don't Say" tweet storm, where just day after day, I just tick through all of the malign activities that I see that the Chinese Communist Party has done. And look, this is beyond my bailiwick, of course, but it bothers me that there are millions of Uyghurs in Western China that are being essentially interned. It bothers me.
Bothers is a I don't want to get it. That's not the point of the thing, but bothers is definitely not even the right language, really. But
absolutely.
But I should say that previous question was from Gary. So thanks for the question, Gary. Stephen Buss is in the chat. Stephen's the lead of our San Francisco chapter. Okay. His question is that NIMBYs in San Francisco, people who try to stop development, people who try to stop things from happening, are fighting 5G expansion. And in San Francisco, frankly, people who try to stop things from developing are often very, very successful. It's part of San Francisco politics. His question is, are there any federal laws that can override local land use controls that can basically allow some of these 5G antennas to happen, even if local governments try to stop them from happening?
So yes and no. No, in the sense that land use traditionally has been a core municipal government function. And so it would be very difficult for the FCC or any federal agency to simply preempt it and assert control for itself over the wide variety of land use regulations that these local governments have. But what I will say is that we have done everything we can to exempt these small cell deployments from some of the more arcane regulations that they've otherwise had to jump through. Environmental and historic preservation review, for instance. We recently issued a declaratory ruling on the meaning of Section 6409 of the Spectrum Act, which said that no locality may deny summarily any wireless siting application. Now, long term, what I would like to see, and this is never going to happen, so it's more of a pipe dream, but I would argue that any inherently interstate activity, which I believe the deployment of a wireless network is, certainly at scale, must be regulated only at the federal level. For the dormant commerce clause, aficionados out there, I would say that we've come to the point in this country where we need to have a single set of consistent regulations, whatever that level of regulation is, everywhere, because otherwise you're going to see some parts of the country really advance where some local and state governments have forward-thinking views, and you're going to see a lot of places fall behind. And I would hate to see a great city like San Francisco do that. I saw the neoliberal tweet today about, not sure if there's a more damning indictment of SF's brand of politics. It's far too difficult to open a new business, virtually impossible to build housing, but at least we're considering removing FDR and Lincoln's names from schools. So I could see the angst in the question in the tweet there that I think underlies the question from Gary.
We've got a question from Bill Pulek, who asks, how do you view the FCC's role in common misconceptions and conspiracy theories around 5G? And this is an interesting question because the FCC's mission is not necessarily to be a communicative organization. That might be a bonus, but the mission statement is to regulate. But do you see that is there an added role, like in just the modern 2020 sense of having to govern? Do you have to be a communicating agency as well? Is it your job to fight that kind of thing?
Yeah, so some of my predecessors definitely disagree with me on this, but I would argue unequivocally, yes. As the first FCC commissioner on Twitter, for example, and one of the reasons is that I thought it was important for us to reach a much broader audience to tell the American people what we were doing. Similarly, I pioneered the reform, which had never been done in decades at the FCC, of actually publishing our proposals and our orders 3 weeks before we voted on them, so that the American public could see what it was we were proposing or deciding to do. And I think that's important to build public confidence in what we're doing. To your point, at least, I think it's incredibly important when it comes to these conspiracy theories for the FCC to have an open book, and that's exactly what we've done. One of our responsibilities is to regulate the RF, the radio frequency exposure limits for wireless services. We've done that based on the science, solely on the science, in consultation with the Food and Drug Administration, which of course has health experts there, the other health agencies that are responsible for this, including the National Toxicology Program. And so based on those limits, we updated the RF rules. And even more than that, we've gone beyond and tried to communicate through statements or speeches or tweets, in my case, the fact that, look, 5G is safe for you. Don't listen to these conspiracy theorists like John Cusack or Woody Harrelson. I don't want to diminish their scientific expertise here by any means. They're both natural-born killers in their own right. But what I would say is that we need to be able to communicate to the people who are a little bit worried. What is 5G? Does it use different frequencies? Is that going to cause cancer and the like? To let them know that if anything, 5G is safer than 4G networks for a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to go into here. But it's really important for us to be able to communicate that, so we forestall some of the potentially dangerous situations we've seen in the Netherlands and Canada, and I believe in the UK, where people are actually torching 5G infrastructure, which is ironic since 5G is one of the things that could help us during this pandemic with telehealth and distance learning and the like.
Yeah, but if 5G was spreading coronavirus, isn't that what you would say?
Yeah, I know. Right? I always want to say, look, coronavirus, analog, right? It spreads to the air. 5G is digital. Like, there's no connection. Analog, digital. It's really, I don't know who started this thing, but my God, it's just really, it's taken hold in some quarters, and that's too bad.
So we've got a couple questions that are related. I'm going to try to synthesize them into one. These are from Bill and from Carla. Bill talks about, has there been any discussion on having the FCC enforce guaranteed SLAs via fining or other methods when a telco might fail to meet their agreements? And Carla brings up the point that, even if CapEx investment is increasing, it might be the case that there are consumers out there who don't feel any of those improvements, and what can be done to ensure that this results in actual service improvements. So it's kind of hinting at the same thing, like whether it's subsidies people are getting or CapEx, how can we hold companies to the promises they're making, whether they are formal promises based on legal subsidies or whether they're informal promises, that when they're building things, these are going to actually help people.
Fantastic issues raised by Carla and Bill, I think you said it was.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that's always bugged me with the Universal Service Fund, is that we sent a lot of money out the door and we never got any bang for the buck, or necessarily got bang for the buck. And so the second month I was in office, we instituted a fundamental reform. In addition to opening this broadband subsidies up for competition and targeting unserved areas, we also instituted very strict accountability requirements that the industry didn't like, because we said, look, if you bid at a certain service threshold and you don't meet that service threshold or don't meet it within a certain period of time, there's an accelerated payback schedule. You may be subject to FCC enforcement action, and you may potentially even be barred from future FCC broadband auctions. And that was really important for the CAF2 auction, which was a $1.5 billion fund. It's essential for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And I can tell you that we spent a lot of time, and if you go through the FCC's order on this, you'll see that the companies have to meet those benchmarks. There are penalties if they don't. And that's I mean, to me at least, that's the name of the game, right? Because it's one thing to get all the huzzas after the press releases go out and the orders are adopted. But what actually matters is, will consumers at the end of this time see the benefits of all this taxpayer funding that's gone to these broadband companies? That is what matters to me. And that's why I talked about the Wind River Reservation and some of the other companies that I visited, because they actually did what they promised they were going to do. And those are the companies that we want to highlight, illustrate as good examples. Outside of the USF context, though, I think there's also a role for us to make sure that the companies do what they say they're going to do. We have an MOU, for example, with the Federal Trade Commission, where we have referred cases of conduct which may be unfair or deceptive, which is within their bailiwick under the FTC Act. Additionally, in the context of the Sprint T-Mobile merger, one of the things that was important to me was, as we approved the merger, to impose a very serious condition that I can guarantee you that I'm sure the companies weren't necessarily thrilled with, which is they had to supply 5G service defined as 50 megabits per second or greater to 99% of the American population within 6 years, with a 97% benchmark after 3 years. If they don't meet either of those benchmarks, there are billions of dollars of funds that annually aggregate until they meet the benchmark. And so that's just one example of how the FCC, even though you might not hear about it in the press or on Twitter or whatever, has put a lot more teeth into its regulatory requirements. Yes, we've been more free market oriented, generally speaking. And yes, we've focused on promoting much more of a business case, but we also promote a lot more accountability and transparency. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, that may well be one of the most significant legacies of the last several years.
All right, so I think we're coming up on time. I have one final quick question for you.
Sure.
Other than following Ajit Pai FCC on Twitter, if people come away from this and they would say, you know, I want to keep up with the FCC more, I want to understand more what they do, I'm curious now, what's the best resource other than your Twitter account? What's the best resource for people to follow the FCC? What's happening? What's the new development? If they want to understand it on a deeper level, where should people go?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly I would encourage folks to follow me on Twitter, although, as you probably know, those of you who follow me, to say that my feed is eclectic is an understatement. But I would hesitate to say go to the FCC's website, but really everything you could possibly want is there. For example, if you're looking for the FCC's 5G Fast Plan, go to fcc.gov/5G. If you're looking at the COVID-19 telehealth program, which we stood up and just executed on, you can go to fcc.gov, I believe it's /COVID-19 telehealth. But there are all these different resources there. Your tribal broadband, we have a page dedicated to that. What are we doing on the digital divide? I know it might seem kind of an unwieldy website, but I can trust me that everything you could want is there. And we're doing a lot of incredible stuff that is super meaningful, stuff we haven't even had a chance to talk about today. I mean, the 3-digit number 988 that it was really important to me to designate for suicide prevention and mental health. This is going to save thousands of lives, tens of thousands of lives in the years to come. Those of you who are interested in that can find out about it on our website. So yeah, I would definitely encourage you to go to fcc.gov and hopefully you'll like what you find there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all the attendees who stuck with us. We had basically everybody stuck with us for the full hour, which is great. Morgan, any closing thoughts?
Nothing other than I'm gonna have to go back and re-listen to this because there's a lot to take in. I'm very happy that we had people join and a ton of questions, both in here and elsewhere. Thank you everyone so much for coming out, and thank you again, Chairman.
Oh, and thank you. I meant to say at the outset, I just can't say enough how much I appreciate your getting in touch. We talked about this a little bit before the live stream started, but it really meant a lot that you did. And I saw this interesting tweet that I think you all put out. Yeah. So someone was asking you, like, how on earth did you get him to appear? And you said, hey, all we did was send him an email. Like, that's really all it takes. And so I just want folks to know that, whatever you might have seen about the big bad FCC or the evil Ajit Pai, I just hope folks know that I try to be as accessible as I can be. And to agree or disagree agreeably, which I think is a hallmark of civil discourse that we need to have in this country. And I can't say enough how much I appreciate the Charlotte chapter and all of the neoliberal chapters across the country for doing such great work to create a forum for reasonable points of view to be exchanged. And I've learned a lot, and I certainly have much more to learn from all of you.
Fantastic. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I think we'll close it out there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
All right.